Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on transitioning to remote learning. It's great to have you with us. I'm Elliot Levine, the Research Director at the Aurora Institute, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. It's part of a series of more than 20 webinars we're offering this fall on important issues from the field of personalized competency-based education. We'll put a link to all of the webinars into the chat box. The webinar series is a prologue to our annual Aurora Institute Symposium, which we're offering virtually this year from October 26th to 28th. So we hope you'll join us and visit our website for more information. We'll also put a link about that into the chat box. Next slide, please. During today's webinar, we encourage you to use the chat box to help us get to know each other and learn from each other. And you could start by introducing yourself in the chat box, and please also use it anytime during today's session to ask questions, add comments, and share insights from your own experiences. We also encourage you to share your thoughts on Twitter using the hashtag provided here and our handle that's shown there. And finally, today's session will be recorded and made available on the Aurora Institute website. And in the next couple days, we'll be sending you a link with the recording and the slide deck that you're seeing here. You can also just go back to our website anytime and retrieve any of our webinars. Next slide, please. Today, we're very fortunate to have three presenters from Michigan Virtual. They are a nonprofit organization that has been a leader in providing online and blended learning for students and professional education for educators for more than 20 years. And now I'll turn it over to Chris Harrington, who will get us started. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you for having us here. We are super excited to be here. As Elliot mentioned, this presentation is really about free online professional learning opportunities for teachers. And at Michigan Virtual, we provide a lot of free resources for educators, and we've had professional learning opportunities for teachers available at no cost. But as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the rapid shift to emergency teaching and learning remotely, we really ramped up that effort, and we're super excited to be able to share some of that with you today. I'd like to meet some of my colleagues. I'm Chris Harrington, the director of Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. I oversee all of the research associated with the organization. Andrea McKay is not able to join us today, although she was very instrumental in helping us pull some of this information together for you. But we are really excited to have Dr. Joe Friedhoff here and Emily Cecilia. Joe, as you can see, is the Vice President of Michigan Virtual, and Emily is our Professional Learning Services Manager. And Emily, to a large extent, is at the heart of this work that we're going to be sharing with you today. So what I'll do now is turn it over to Joe, and Joe's going to give you a little bit more of a background of some of the things that Michigan Virtual offers, just so you have some context and understand where we're coming from and why we pull these resources together for everyone. Joe?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So as Elliot mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization, and we've been in existence since 1998. And we do kind of three things. The first thing that we do is we offer online courses to students, and traditionally that offering has been with our teachers. So we employ our own teachers and we develop our content or get third-party content. And most of the students in schools use us to supplement what they're doing in the brick and mortar. We're not a cyber school. You cannot graduate from us. In fact, we don't even give grades. We just report back to the local school district the number of points a student earned out of the number of points possible. And then the local school district determines how that gets transcripted. Since this conversation is a lot about the transitioning to remote learning and the effects of COVID, we've really been trying this fall to ramp up a new form of student learning where schools were able to use our content, but their teacher in our learning management system. And that's been a good step for us, and we're finding lots of school districts who are interested in taking that step, but it's a particular challenge. So, that's what we're kind of doing on the student side. To give you a kind of a measure, last fall we had about 13,000 enrollments, and last year we had about 30,000 over the entire year. This fall already, we're going to be looking at about 40 to 50,000 just this fall alone. So that's been the effects of COVID and the transitioning to remote that we're seeing in the state of Michigan. That student side has always been also supplemented by our professional learning opportunities. And we have done a tremendous amount. Emily helps lead our professional learning team, but whether it's bus drivers, food service workers, teachers, administrators, so on. We have a lot of online professional development that's for them. That could be for compliance purposes, such as the dangers of bloodborne pathogens that people need to be certified in from one year to the next. We're involved with state initiatives like early literacy. So our state had a big push in K-3 reading, and we worked with other organizations across the state to develop a comprehensive training that every K-3 teacher would be receiving. And for fidelity and scalability purposes, we developed modules that could be accessed at any time and anywhere, and then coaches throughout the state could work with staff kind of on the ground. And Emily and some of our other coaches, go into the field and work in both face-to-face capacity of training people how to teach in blended and online environments or with more technology they may ordinarily. So we have a pretty robust professional learning team as well, and I'll mention a little bit more about that when we get into some of the effects of COVID. And then finally, as Chris alluded to earlier, we are pretty unique in the fact that we have a research institute and have since about, I think, the 2012-2013 school year. And the state funds us to look at best practices and research in this space and policy development and kind of data. So we do a tremendous amount of work to try to help spread what is the lessons that we're learning either through the student or professional learning groups that we have or through other connections that we have so that we can increase the performance of students in this sector. So Chris, why don't I turn it back over to you and you can start talking a little bit more about some of the stuff that we did in the transition to COVID.
Sure. Yeah. And, a lot of these, while we're focusing on professional learning opportunities and what we've put together there for educators, there are a lot of other resources too. And I would just encourage you, if you just go to michiganvirtual.org, you'll be able to get to all of this information that we have. But just want to highlight a few things here for you. One of the first things we did as soon as the schools in the state of Michigan were pushed into this emergency remote teaching and learning, we formed a statewide expert group, and it was a work group, and it was comprised of about 25 organizations, different people within different organizations, school leaders, administrators, teacher leaders, curriculum specialists, and researchers, of course. And we pulled together and we just talked about issues and helped solve each other's problems and give guidance to each other, share experiences. As part of that process, there were some artifacts that we created around professional development, LMS selection, and also like a content repository of sorts, more like a directory, I guess. But it's certainly something to check out. And on the slide that you see in front of you right now, there are links here. So when the slide deck is shared out, there'll be hot links for you. But again, you can go to michiganvirtual.org to get them. We also formed a Facebook page. That was, I'm going to say that was within days of the school closure announcements across the state of Michigan. And we have currently over 3,000, as you can see there, 3,700 active members, and it's teachers and administrators sharing all these different ideas. That is still an active group, so feel free to jump on board there. We also have a webinar series, and we pulled together, it's more than a dozen webinars specifically about how to navigate and how to be effective and thrive in a remote learning environment. Anything from, how to get started teaching virtually, different tips and tricks, providing accommodations, differentiation, web accessibility, you name it, top to bottom. A lot of great information there. They're all free. By all means, just go ahead and check those out. And then we also created some very specific tools for school leaders as they're making a transition to learning continuity and some longer term planning. So, so it's not just teachers that we're providing resources for, but administrators as well. Joe, can you share a little bit about some of the other things that we're doing?
Yeah, one of the things we recognized early on with the pandemic is that schools were going to be needing and accessing high quality free content. And fortunately, we were in a position where over the last handful of years, we had been working to try to create a lot of our student content in a way that was not dependent on a learning management system. And so that really paid off for us this spring when we were able to release content from about 70 different courses, and mostly at the high school level, maybe a little bit in the middle school. But these are content packages that we were able to make available. They don't include the assessments, but they do include a lot of a really rich curriculum that schools were able to move to. And if they're using a Google Classroom or a more robust LMS, they could link to those assets and use that content starting this spring. And we initially thought, well, hopefully it'll be no longer needed come July or so, but we have extended it for the rest of this year until July of the following year. So that content is available if people want to try to access it. We have also seen a need where, people just, they need to talk to other experts and have an opportunity to ask their questions. And so we created this little pilot of what we call virtual office hours, where educators can get in and meet with some of our instructional design team or some of our coaches and get specific questions answered that they may be struggling with or thinking about. And so those sessions are things that we're offering at no cost. We have had a history with an organization called Evolution Labs to work on SEL, or social emotional learning products, in the state of Michigan. And I'm sure no matter where you're from, that the topic of social emotional learning and student health has been pretty high on the list of conversations. We were fortunate enough to work with the governor's office and secure funding to be able to run this Michigan Cares program for this upcoming year, where parents and students and teachers can have access at no cost to them to a bunch of mental health resources. I think there are over 500 resources in that website that they can go and register for. So we were able to work with legislators and others and third parties to bring together this resource. So no matter where you went to school, you had hopefully a pretty high quality access to social and emotional learning. We also have a parenting series that we had from an expert from a former consultant at the Department of Ed about how you parent during this pandemic as it relates to social and emotional learning. And then really we're going to get into an example or a few examples of what we've done in professional development when I turn it over to Emily here in a minute. But to give you an idea, since March 1st, which is kind of pretty close to when COVID started, we have been delivering an amazing amount of professional learning. I know that number on the slide says 106, but with everything in COVID times, it changes rapidly. So I think the number at the end of August was closer to 127,000 enrollments. And in terms of sketches, which are continuing education clock hours, I know that just since March, are close to 200,000 hours of professional learning that teachers are able to use to keep their certifications active or and the like. So we've been very, very active in that professional development. Are really kind of excited to be able to showcase and share some of what we did to do that switch and transition to remote. And Emily will be talking a little bit more about that effort.
Thanks, Joe. So as we kind of turn our attention to all of those things that Joe and Chris mentioned that we've been working on since March, which is a pretty substantial list, we're just going to share with you one tiny piece of one of those things that we did. So we want to take you back, and we want you to kind of go back to March and April. And if you would, in the chat, if you could answer the following question. So what were some of the biggest setbacks that you experienced with transitioning to remote learning? So what were some of the biggest setbacks this past spring that you experienced or your staff experienced with it transitioning to remote learning? And again, if you could just put your thoughts in the chat, we'd love to see what you have. Chris or Joe, do we have any that we might want to expand on?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. You know, one of the things that Reggie provided was internet connectivity, and I think Darren is talking along the same lines there. Just technology in general, that's been brought up here. So you know, ensuring that kids have the technology devices, but then also the connectivity to be able to do something with it.
Yeah, and I think Mary Beth mentioned about time zones, which may not be necessarily as typical with each of the other, you know, schools that people are represented from. But then the idea about time not being the same, you know, like you can't be guaranteed that everyone's going to be accessing an online at 8 o'clock versus 8 a.m. versus 8 p.m. That dynamic of changing within the day is something that school districts really kind of struggled with in trying to figure out how, you know, how do you do something even as simple as taking attendance, but managing that synchronous versus asynchronous activities, definitely a challenge across time zones, but you know, also complicated even within the same time zone.
You know, Emily, I'll mention something else here that that I know in working with schools, especially as part of that work group that I mentioned before, those school districts across the state of Michigan. There were a few things that really popped up as being concerns. Certainly, the social emotional pieces, and having some disconnect with the kids there, and communication in general. I've learned suffered a lot, simply because not all families were geared to be able to communicate this way. So that was a piece there as well. And you know, Mary Beth just added something in the chat also along the lines of teachers not having the necessary technology experiences. You know, so you know, I think we've all grown a lot, being forced into this remote world now, where I think a lot of people's skills have developed since back in March when the school closures occurred. However, back then, you know, this was a very new thing for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for sharing your thoughts with us. Thinking about some of those items that you mentioned in the chat, we really wanted to do something to support educators during this time. And so what we came up with was a series of really short, non-facilitated, self-paced courses. And as you can see in this list here, some of those setbacks that were mentioned in the chat appear here, such as adapting to meet needs, the SEL component that we know is so important, communicating. Mary Beth, that synchronous and asynchronous topic is included in this getting started module. So just trying to think about what do teachers need, what would educators need right now to help support their students. And as a result, we came up with this series of 6 online courses. As we were developing these courses, we had certain things that we wanted to keep in mind. One of these considerations was including to model. We really wanted to model what we're asking educators to do. So for example, we thought checklists might be really important to support keeping students and teachers on pace and track so they know what they need to do. So all of these courses have checklists, the reflection items. So on and so forth. We wanted to make sure that whatever we're asking teachers to do, we are modeling that in the course as best we can. The next consideration is we really wanted to make sure that we are encouraging teachers, that we are cheering them on, and kind of goes to the last point, not to overwhelm them, because this transition was huge, especially for, I think, those less techie teachers, right, who don't have a lot of experience with technology. So really being a cheerleader for them and making them see that this is possible. Next, we really wanted these to be short and to the point. These courses are expected to take you no more than 2 hours to go through the content, because we know teachers' times are short and they're probably going back and forth between different tasks. So we wanted to, that also goes back to the modeling, we wanted to keep our sections really short because we would encourage teachers to kind of break their activities up into shorter pieces as well. We also have a lot of courses that Joe mentioned online already that existed in terms of blended and online learning. And so to kind of make it easier on us, again, what we're asking teachers to do, we did not reinvent the wheel. We pulled certain content from our already existing courses to put it kind of together, to format it, just like we're asking teachers to reuse and remix their own content. And again, I already mentioned that point. We really didn't want teachers to be overwhelmed with this.
Emily, can I jump in for a minute?
Please do.
One of the macro components I'm looking at this slide and thinking about is, while this was true of what you wanted, I guess, for when you were creating it for the people who were taking the course, was very similar, I think, a list from an administrator and or like one of the leaders at Michigan Virtual and trying to get the content created in the first place. You know, Emily and her team did an amazing job of creating this whole curriculum in like a week or two, where ordinarily our process might take an entire semester and a lot of polish and a lot of script writing and so on. We basically had to get in a mindset and say, hey, there are things we know that people can benefit from tomorrow. We need to put pressure on making sure we get that out. And maybe some other things are going to suffer, and perhaps longer term we would go out and you know, make it into a more polished course. But timing was of such an essence that modeling, it's okay to get, you know, something else out that's quicker or shortened to the point, and reusing and remixing that content and not overwhelming our own team was part of what we tried to focus on, and find bite-sized chunks, 6 2-hour courses that we could get up and running in just a couple of weeks and really make a significant impact without necessarily too much of an investment.
Absolutely. And I think it also, for everyone involved, we pulled a lot of different departments together to make this work really, really quickly, like Joe mentioned. And I think it was a labor of love for all of us, just because we wanted to do something and we really felt like this was one way that we could help support teachers. So thank you for adding that, Joe. In terms of the course organization, all 6 courses are organized very similarly. We mentioned that checklist. All courses have a learning checklist, so learners understand what they should be able to do at the completion or during the course. There's a self-evaluation, and this self-evaluation is based on one of the items that Michigan Virtual created, which is a teacher checklist, to see where are you in certain areas and where could you go. So kind of where are you, and then looking forward. There's the learning portion. Here's that checklist, that self-evaluation, and then here's the learning portion. This is just from the first course. So they all have different content in this area. Each of the courses has a reflection point. So again, asking teachers to think, all right, with what you already know, what you might have learned in this course, how are you going to move forward? What's your plan in this topic? And then at the end, there's a knowledge check. It's just a really quick 3-question quiz just to check and make sure that they understood the main points of the course. So again, all of these components are present in all of the courses. Again, we wanted to model that having the same format is also really important for teachers as they're creating content. So again, that comes back to that modeling piece. Now we are actually going to dive in, and we're just going to give you a real quick look at one of the transition courses. So this is Transitioning to Remote Teaching 1. This is getting started, so this is the initial course. And when you log in, there's an introduction. All of our introductions are very similar. So I'm just going to click Launch Unit. And then just this is a brief description about the introduction. All of our courses have this welcome and a brief kind of overall learning statement. They have the learning objectives, the course outline, so what will they see in the content, the grading policy, so what do they need to do to make sure that they have successfully completed the course and how to check their progress. The facilitation, it's not facilitated, it's open entry, so they can enter the course at any time and take as long or as short as they would like to complete it. And then again, what they need to do to complete. And this is just a Michigan specific. We have state continuing education clock hours, or what we call sketches or skeechies, whoever you're talking to, they might pronounce it differently, to recertify. So this is usually very important for a lot of our teachers as well. And then an etiquette and integrity part. A lot of these components were actually taken from the National Standards for Quality Online Courses. So we modeled a lot of what is included in this welcome based on their recommendations. So I'm going to go to the next. Content, again, this is just help and support. These items are also taken from the NSQ National Standards for Quality Online Courses. What should the support look like? You need to have the technical prereqs, the technology requirements, accessibility, course navigation, and then this is just a link to our customer care. So we really fell back on, not only making it accessible, but we wanted to make sure that we were modeling best practices within our course as well. And this is oh, go ahead, Chris.
Can I ask a question? Just to confirm, all of these courses that we're talking about, they all have this same kind of structure and consistency to it, correct?
That is correct. Yep.
Yeah, and that's something that that I've heard loud and clear from schools, is the fact that when we made this shift to emergency teaching, and everybody was kind of doing their own thing, it got to be a tremendous cognitive load for kids, trying to just manage all the different places and the different formats and structures of courses. So again, to your point of modeling, keeping that consistency is really, really important.
Absolutely. This, you might notice it says hidden in number 1. So just for the introductory course, these, the checklists that we mentioned, and I'll just click on that so you can kind of have an idea of what that looks like. So this is more for teachers to go through. So a checklist. So in the topic of communications, I use a digital tool to communicate with parents. I use a digital tool to communicate with students. I use a digital tool that allows for video conferencing to facilitate real-time discussions. So if they check all those, that would tell them, okay, I'm pretty set for this. If they only check a few, it might mean you might have a little bit more work to do. If they don't have any, we have a couple suggestions down here on where they might go. I'm gonna go back to the course. So that's one of the resources. These are mentioned in the subsequent courses. It's introduced in this course, which is why it says it's hidden, but I wanted to highlight it. We also have a teacher continuity readiness rubric. This was also developed by Michigan Virtual. I believe I might have mentioned it earlier. So it has different topics such as communication, content delivery, curricular materials, technology skills, learning communities, adaptability, assessments, and relationships. And so teachers can see these I statements and see where do they fall, where do they align, and again, where am I right now, and where do I maybe need to go? So just kind of a self-evaluation tool. So those components are the same throughout all 6 courses. I'm gonna go back to content. The content portion is what varies from course to course. So this is a learning checklist. This shows what the participants need to do to complete. So they need to complete the self-evaluation, understand what remote teaching can look like, identify factors to keep in mind during transitioning, and to reflect on what resources and tools are already available. This is that self-evaluation checklist, but in a Google format. So it's a little bit, or Google Forms format. So it's a little bit more interactive. So again, they're I statements, so teachers can kind of put themselves in the situation. Does this match up with what I do? So for this course, it's I feel comfortable transitioning to remote teaching. I communicate effectively with students and families online. I already deliver most of my content and assessments online. I am able to differentiate my instruction online. I am able to provide an accessible online learning environment for my students. So participants can go through and check these boxes, and then we count up. I have 3 out of 5, so I click the next button. And then based on how many they click, there is no wrong or right answer here. It just kind of guides them as to what they might really focus on in the course. So if they marked all the boxes, you marked all the boxes checked, it looks like you are well positioned to transition to remote learning. You may want to browse the information in the course to learn additional tips and tricks to remote teaching. If they mark some of the boxes, it looks like you're already doing quite a bit to successfully transition to remote learning. Use the rest of this course to give you a big picture of how you might pull all the components together. And then if they didn't check any, no worries. Remember, we want to make sure that we're positive and we're encouraging. So we're here to support you during this transition time. This course will provide big picture examples of what remote teaching could look like, as well as some tips and tricks to help things run smoothly for you and your students. So that's kind of how that looks. That is the same with different checkboxes for each one. Again, to help maybe personalize the course a little bit more so participants know what path or what they should be looking at specifically. So here we just have what does remote teaching look like. These are the rubric, the checklist and rubric that I mentioned earlier, so I'm not going to expand those, but this is where it's initially introduced. Also, I should probably take a side note. These were somewhat designed to go in order, but not necessarily. We really wanted educators to be able to self-select on topics that were most important to them. So they could dive right into the second transition course without taking the first, but not miss anything. Here we have the differences of face-to-face and remote teaching. Again, you'll see we wanted it to be brief, so it's really short, just bullet points and 2 columns. Next are examples of remote learning. So we use video examples here. So we have an elementary example of how you might do remote learning using Seesaw. A secondary example of remote learning with Google Classroom. I believe in this one. Yeah, I also did this webinar. But I used some of that content that Joe shared that we made available, those links that port really nicely into Google Classroom where you can just grab them. And again, the assessments aren't there, but it's really good quality content for teachers to use so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. This is another great example from Jennifer Bond on what her Google Classroom looks like. She's a middle school teacher. And then again, Mary Beth, I think somebody was talking about our less techie teachers. So just an example of how you might deliver content with Google Slides. So something really basic, just using one Google tool and how you might disseminate information and assignments using that. This is one of the biggest questions we get from teachers, no matter what we're talking about, is what does it look like? So we really wanted to make sure that we highlight some of those possibilities for them. Next, we talked about some considerations. We almost always ask teachers to start with what you know. You don't need to throw everything out, but start where you are and identify areas, baby steps to move forward. So here are some questions to kind of have them start thinking about where they are and where they might need to go, or if they even need to tweak something. The next one is to keep it simple. This goes back to modeling as well. As you can see, our content is pretty simplistic and it's not a lot on a screen. Again, trying to model for our teachers bite-sized pieces for their students. Being mindful of time. Somebody brought up the synchronicity part of it. So just being mindful that maybe not all students are able to connect or be online at the same time. And so designing learning to support those students as well. Also, being mindful that online learning takes a little bit longer than it does face-to-face. And we also have expectations that were shared with from a lot of our Michigan schools of what, based on the grade level, what time should they be spending online. So we shared that in here as well. And then last, we had some additional resources. Casey Bell, if you're familiar with her, she's a big Google guru. Strategies for learning continuity, the full webinar, and different resources, including Idaho Digital. And then is that reflection piece. In this, in each of the courses, we really tried to highlight just one tech tool that teachers might want to incorporate into their teaching. So here you see a Padlet. We use the Padlet as a reflection piece. So teachers could anonymously respond to the question, what do you already use that can be shifted to online? And what do you want to make sure that you keep as you transition to online? And they can view their other responses, and then they can heart them or like them as such. So it's a little more interactive. Unfortunately, this will not let you see the knowledge check, but it's a quick 3 questions about the content. And then again, we had that beginning, the introduction part, that content part, and then the conclusion is the same. So we go over, again, what do you need to complete the course? How do you check that? That's sketches for Michigan educators. We include, all of our courses have surveys in them because we are continuously wanting to improve. And then the what's next, so they can see that they can go through all 6 of the courses in the series. I'm going to pause right now. If anybody has anything to add or questions.
Yeah, Emily moved kind of quickly through that survey part, but I would say, you know, one of the feathers in the cap of the team that designed it is that we have over a 90% satisfaction rate with the professional learning courses that people had. So it was well received, and the feedback was very positive about it, really helping, and I think providing them some support during a really difficult time.
Do you have anything? Are there any questions? I did go through that really quickly.
I know Chris put a link in the chat to some of the other learning continuity, our learning continuity page, which has a bunch of the resources that Emily referenced or that we referenced earlier. So thanks for doing that. Chris and Susan, thanks for sharing positive feedback about it.
All right. I wanted to add too that currently we have 8,000, just under 9,000 participants enrolled in those 6 courses right now. And so they have become really popular, as well as when we first released them, we saw so many educators electing to do this. They wanted to know, how do I help my students? How do I get my classroom ready? How do I support them? And to see that, and as we come into the fall, some districts have elected to offer these for their teachers, but overwhelmingly, teachers have been self-selecting to take these courses online. So I think that speaks to kind of the need as well of what's there. The next part I'm going to go through is just real briefly, because see we're running on time here. Just some of the course objectives that'll give you a little bit more idea of what is in the other 5 courses. So we already talked about the first one, getting started. The communication online. So we ask participants to understand the role communication plays in remote learning. We know it's so important, and it looks a little different online than it does face-to-face. And then how to communicate both with students and families using different methods. I know working with middle school and high school kids, they don't check their email. So hopefully we might see a breakthrough this year with a transition where they do check their email a little bit more regularly. But I know trying to connect with them via email was not very successful when I worked with them. And so I had to either send a video or use a Remind app or get their text number and use Google to kind of filter that to connect with those students. So thinking about not your transition or not your typical ways of connecting, both with students and with families. So trying to be mindful and adapting to what both our students and families need. And then again, there's that reflection piece of where are you and where are you going to go with this? For digital content, we talk about organizing that content, again, trying to model in those courses of how we have an introduction, there's the content piece, and then there's usually some type of assessment. Exploring those digital content creation tools, we highlight open educational resources in that section as well. So OER as a really good place to find content and quality content, as well as the Michigan virtual content. And then again, that reflection piece of where are you going to get your content and how might you organize it online. For assessments, feedback is a really important part of assessments, especially online. And so we gave them the acronym of REPLY. So when they're offering feedback, making sure that it's responsive, it's effective feedback, it's positive, it is learning, encouraging learning, and then the Y stands for you, but it means personalized. So helping them understand when they do give feedback, what does the content look like in those feedback pieces. Also sharing that, you know, just a quiz online, while probably easy and easy to grade, might not always be the best route to evaluate student knowledge and skills and behaviors. So offering some different ideas of how you might want to assess where students are, and then some tools to explore using that. And again, that reflection piece. Adapting to meet needs, so talking about the need for flexibility, especially when learning online. It's going to be different for everybody, so being flexible is kind of the name of the game, and I think it still is. I don't think that's changed since the spring. How educators might differentiate learning for students, and then exploring ideas to meet those needs. And again, there's that reflection piece. Lastly, we know that social emotional learning plays a huge role and continues to play a huge role in educating our students, especially reaching them online. So we offered some different resources on how to support students, how we might support families online, as they have now become the mentors for their students. And we probably should have put this first, but the importance of teacher self-care. At Michigan Virtual, we talk about sharpening the saw, so making sure that you yourself are taken care of so you can also take care of your other responsibilities, and how important that is. And so our reflection focuses on what are you going to do to make sure that you as an educator are taking care of yourself during this time. Gonna pause. Joe or Chris, questions or anything you want to add here?
There was a request for you to add the REPLY acronym or repeat it, but if you would just put it in the chat there, maybe repeat it and then add it in the chat so that the people can recall what that is.
Sure. I'll say it first. So it's responsive, effective, positive, learning, you, which means it's personalized. You is a little bit off. We had to really make that one fit, but I will definitely add that to the chat.
Thanks.
Anything?
Go to the next slide and ask our reflection question at the end here.
So ending on a positive note before we kind of go into our closing here, we're asking you, what was a positive outcome for you or your staff or even your students from this transition period? So what was a positive outcome? And it might have been from the spring, or it might even be now from transitioning to remote learning. And we invite you to, again, if you want to add those thoughts to the chat. And while you're doing that, I will type in the REPLY acronym.
You know, while folks are typing in their information or gathering their thoughts, I'd like to share an experience that I had with a school district that when they were reflecting on how the spring went. And this was a district that was pretty well poised to make a shift to remote teaching and learning, just because of all the other pieces that they had in place, to, you know, the student-centered pieces and technology pieces they had in place. the one thing that was a surprise by the school district was the fact that the teachers realized that they didn't know their students as well as they thought they did. So when they had to actually start communicating more directly with families, and they were actually, even though through video conference, in the homes of the families, they could learn more about the students. And they were really excited about that. And I think that just kind of ramped up their whole idea about what it really means to develop relationships with the kids and get to know the kids. And I think that was one very positive outcome that I saw from one particular school district.
I can add my experience with that, Chris, as well. So we've done a lot of remote synchronous training with Michigan Virtual, and prior to COVID, I think there would be a lot more support. We would have to have offered a lot more support with how do we use Zoom as a video conferencing tool, of how to utilize Zoom with a platform and going back and forth. And we found, it seems simple, but we found that people are pretty well able to go back and forth using a video conferencing tool, as well as using a platform and following along where to go and opening up links. And I think just the growth in understanding and using technology from our educators has been huge. And I think that's a positive that's probably come out of this.
I'll share one from a kind of a policy perspective. You know, last year, well, I guess 2 school years ago, we had a pretty brutal winter where a lot of schools lost significant time during the winter to snow days and other kinds of closures. This year, obviously, it was a ton of lost learning due to COVID. But out of this effort, our legislature passed this fall a series of bills meant to kind of reform some of the educational policies, and one of which was around virtual learning days. And so they moved to a policy that is a little bit more akin to what's in Illinois, but essentially instead of allowing 6 school days to be waived because of snow days and the kids don't have to make it up, they've moved to more like 2 days, and then the rest of those need to be provided to students through remote opportunities. And there's some more days that if it's scheduled, for instance, I think there's up to 20 days that a school can schedule. As long as it's on their calendar and they say this is going to be a remote learning day, they can count them as such. And I see those as really kind of positive steps forward for student learning and the ability to have continuity of learning when the next issues come across, whether it's weather related or whether it's health related. And I have seen that as kind of a good step from a policy perspective as well. Well, I'm not seeing much in the chat right now. Maybe some more will come, but why don't we just kind of talk a little bit of some of the closing thoughts and some next steps. So I'll just kind of talk about next steps. I mean, today we really wanted to share with you guys a lot of the resources that we've produced over the last handful of months as we've thought deeply about helping to prepare school districts and school personnel, families, students for this transition to COVID. And I think we have done a pretty good job of that. Certainly lessons learned and things we'd do differently if we could go back, but on the whole, we feel pretty positive about what we were able to produce. At the same time, when you look at something like the feature of today's talk, which is 6 2-hour courses and training, we recognize that that's really not likely to have a significant sustained impact on student and teacher habits and practices. And Chris and I were over the last few years, we're working on an IES grant about student orientation. And it's kind of fascinating to have gone through this, but essentially what we did is we studied whether a student orientation of a few hours could make a positive difference on student performance at the end of the course. And We used randomization for that, and essentially the results were no. We couldn't find any significant student performance impact by having a couple of hour orientation. And I suspect that in some ways, while we may have reduced some anxiety and we may have made that transition a little bit better, it's probably harder for that better to actually pay off in terms of student performance and outcomes. And so we've been thinking as we move forward and we move into the fall, you know, this was really good and what we could do in a couple weeks, but how do we create a sustained program of professional learning for teachers? And in this, a couple of our new models for students, what we are doing now instead is the teachers who teach in those models, we're providing them with a 10-month, what we call a 10-month onboarding process, where at the beginning there was, I think like 11 or 18 hours, depending on which model you were in, of synchronous training or asynchronous training that they would go through to kind of develop some of the competencies around the learning management system and some of the basic online pedagogies. But then after that, each month, we have a new featured topic and a new thing that gets released to them. So the first one, for instance, was, I think in September, was around pre-flight checklists. How do you know and what do you look for before you launch your course and make sure it's ready to go? And each month we're going to introduce a new topic so that as we progress along, we're giving those teachers more and more training, hopefully somewhat aligned to the period of time of that year and the trajectory of the school year, when, you know, teacher evaluation and how do you evaluate teachers at a particular period of time. So we're trying to create a more of a sustained program, a more programmatic approach in how we're treating this. But in these particular cases, you kind of see them a little bit more as one-off and self-selected, but for schools and programs that are looking more holistically, that's part of our next steps. Chris, can I just kind of let you turn over for a few and then bring Elliot back to kind of share his closing thoughts?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to mention a few resources here that can help in this whole area that we've been talking about. First of all, I'm going to throw in the chat the links here, but the courses that Emily's been sharing with us, there's a direct link there to our professional learning, and you can take a look at those and get a closer view. We also created a website. We're leading the development of a website across the state of Michigan called Keep Michigan Learning, and there are also professional learning resources there as well. And they're free, of course. And the third link that I shared is actually kind of answers your question, Susan, about do we have some resources? We do have a series of 6 guides that are available to help schools and families and kids with their with being successful in online learning. And there's one specifically for students. There's one for teachers, administrators, etc. And so I would highly recommend that you know, even those schools that are just making this temporary shift to online or virtual learning, there is a ton of value in these guides here for you. And as you formalize and develop a more robust online learning program, they're only going to help you more and more. So, so they're available to you. And again, once you get this, this presentation, these are hot links too that'll take you there. The last piece I would mention is we do have some courses on how to use National Standards of Quality for online courses, and that'll be coming out in the future. But you know, for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and I'll just toss this right back to Elliot.
Great, thanks so much. And Chris, Emily, and Joe, it's been so valuable to hear about the work you're doing at Michigan Virtual. And we really appreciate your insights and resources about how to transition to remote learning more effectively. And seeing what you've developed, it's not surprising to hear about the thousands and thousands of teachers and students that are taking advantage of these really timely resources. So thanks so much for developing them and for sharing them with us today. I also wanted to remind participants in the webinar that this recording and the slide deck will be available very soon on our website. To close out today's session, I wanted to share more information about our ongoing pre-symposium webinar series. You can see 9 of our upcoming webinars in this series that are taking place in September, and we'll be offering more of them, putting more of them up on our website soon. And if we could have the next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, our Aurora Institute Symposium will be held virtually this year, and it's going to be on October 26th to 28th. You can also go to our website or use the link in the chat box to find out more information about that. And we, of course, hope that you'll join us. And next slide. So thanks to everyone for participating in today's webinar. And we invite you to stay connected with us at the Aurora Institute and of course with Michigan Virtual as well. And please join me in thanking our presenters from Michigan Virtual for that terrific presentation. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. And thanks and take care.